The air smelled like sun-dried leaves and the faint mineral scent of dry soil when I first noticed the problem. I had been walking my usual loop along the edge of the trail that backed up to my property, a daily ritual since retiring from the Department of Environmental Resources. 40 years I spent in the field, 30 as a certified stormwater engineer, 10 in emergency environmental response. But now it was just me, my boots, and the land beneath them. And the land was whispering trouble. The Maple Glen HOA trail wasn't new, but recent additions were. A freshly poured concrete footbridge wider than it needed to be. A few glossy kiosks with plastic laminated maps. A brand new gravel parking pad near the entrance. All done with the kind of enthusiastic flair that screamed tourism dollars and summer camp registrations, not hydrology. It wasn't the improvements themselves that worried me. It was how they'd been installed. No culvert under the new bridge. Improper grading. Drainage lines from the parking area leading nowhere. And to top it off, the existing swale that ran through the woods, a critical runoff channel I'd quietly maintained behind my fence for years, was now choked with wood chips and trampled dirt from recent landscaping. They'd interrupted the water's logic, and when water loses logic, it writes its own. I typed out the first email the night I got back from that walk. It was direct, respectful, and laced with red flags. Dear board members, as a homeowner and licensed drainage engineer, with 4 decades of experience in water management systems, I feel compelled to express urgent concern regarding the trail development and recent additions. Based on my assessment, several components of the trail's current layout, particularly the western slope, grading, and unchanneled runoff zones, pose significant flood risks in the event of a heavy rain. Please see attached a preliminary drainage redesign plan I've created voluntarily at no cost. These changes are minimal but necessary to mitigate long-term damage and liability. I am available to discuss this in person or at the next HOA meeting. Respectfully, John R. Halstead, PE Ret. I attached the PDF. 6 pages, 3 diagrams, and a simulation showing how a modest 3-inch per hour rainfall could turn the trail into a miniature river. I heard nothing for a week. Then came the reply from Karen Liddell, president of the HOA, typed in the distinctive passive-aggressive tone that HOA leaders seem to learn at some secret retreat. Mr. Halstead, thank you for your passion and care for our community. At this time, the board has reviewed our vendor reports and we are confident in their assessments. We kindly ask that homeowners refrain from interfering with approved plans. Best, HOA management. I stared at the email for a long moment. No mention of the actual issues raised. No acknowledgement of the diagrams. Refrain from interfering as if knowledge were intrusion. As if offering free expertise equated to meddling. I wasn't surprised. This was the same HOA that once fined a neighbor for hanging wind chimes that were too reflective. The same group that held a vote to remove native grass plots because they looked messy. To them, credentials were only valuable when printed on a vendor invoice. But I wasn't ready to let it go. I printed my drainage report 3-hole, punched it, and brought a dozen copies to the next HOA meeting. The chairs in the community hall were arranged in neat rows, plastic and unforgiving. Karen stood near the front, her blonde bob helmeted in hairspray, flanked by Jim, the treasurer who always looked like he smelled something unpleasant, and Lacey, from events, who had a clipboard she clutched like a baton of righteousness. Mr. Halstead, Karen said as I approached the microphone during public comment, please be brief. We have a full agenda tonight. I nodded. Of course, I'll be quick. I held up the report. As I stated in my email, I've identified serious concerns about the trail drainage. This area is in a floodplain buffer. Some of your recent construction, while visually appealing, disrupts historical runoff paths, and if uncorrected, will collapse under the strain of a significant storm event. My proposal, Sir Karen interrupted, smiling tightly, we appreciate your concerns, but we've consulted professionals. I am a professional, I said, licensed by the state. 40 years of flood management design. I helped write the watershed protocol that this county enforces. The room fell quiet. For a moment, I thought that got through, but then Jim chuckled. Well, if you helped write it, maybe that explains why things are such a mess. There was scattered laughter. A few residents smirked. Karen didn't laugh, but she didn't stop them either. I left the report copies on the table and walked out without another word. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea growing cold in my hands. Through the window, I could see the edge of the woods and the trailhead sign glowing under the amber streetlight. They'd built that sign without considering the soil elevation beneath it. I'd warned them. I'd tried. But you can't force someone to understand what they don't respect. Instead, I printed 2 more copies of my drainage plan, this time addressed to the city's Public Works Department and the County Floodplain Office. I sent one by email, one by certified mail. Not out of spite, but because I knew storms didn't care about egos. They only cared about gradients, pressure, and gravity. And the skies were getting heavy. The first signs that the HOA was doubling down came 2 days after that uncomfortable meeting. I was raking leaves in my front yard when a maintenance truck pulled up to the trail entrance. 2 young men hopped out, both wearing polos, with the HOA's emerald green logo stitched across the chest. They unloaded bags of mulch, pressure washers, and a wooden plaque wrapped in plastic. Trail dedication ceremony, next Saturday. It read in cheerful blue script with little cartoon water droplets along the bottom. The irony wasn't lost on me. I walked over to the edge of the trail, still muddy in places from a recent shower, and watched them lay out the tools. The western slope, a soft incline that dipped into a shallow runoff area, was now covered in decorative stone and benches bolted directly into the ground. No drainage pipes, no filtration plan, just aesthetics. "Excuse me," I said politely, nodding to the younger one with a beard. "Do you happen to know if the construction team followed the stormwater specs for this area?" He blinked. We're just volunteers, sir." HOA said, "Spread mulch and install signage. We're not really the construction guys." I gave a small nod. Of course. Volunteers with no idea they were helping build a flood funnel. Inside the clubhouse, the preparations continued. Karen and Lacey sent out email blasts about the Grand Trail opening and family camp preview day, boasting about summer activity plans. There were flyers pinned to community boards with bright cartoonish maps, picnic zones, outdoor classrooms, birdwatching shelters, each built over terrain I'd mapped out a dozen times in flood risk models. They were so enamored with building community pride, they didn't notice they were stacking a matchstick house on a saturated sponge. I watched quietly as more changes rolled in over the next week: an oversized restroom facility near the creek bed, paved footpaths that curved closer to the bend of the stream, and rows of solar lights driven into damp, shifting soil. Some parts of the trail now had sections where you could feel the spring beneath your feet when you stepped just enough give to know that the ground wasn't packed properly. One afternoon, I passed by while the new landscaper, a broad-shouldered man with a clipboard and a radio, was yelling at 2 teenage workers about leveling sod. I cleared my throat. "You the new site lead?" He looked up. "You with the HOA?" "No, just a concerned resident. Retired water systems engineer. I was wondering if you had an erosion control plan for the eastern ridge." He eyed me like I'd spoken Klingon. "Sir, we follow the HOA's build specs. That's it. If there's an issue, take it up with them." I did, I said simply. They ignored it. "Well," he muttered, turning back to his clipboard. "Not my problem." That phrase stuck with me. Not my problem. It was the invisible motto of bad planning, something I'd heard too often at disaster sites over the years. The logic of disassociation. As long as someone else signed the form, someone else held the liability. Problem was, water didn't read signatures. By the end of the month, a wooden camp stage had gone up, built on the flat basin beside the creek. It was a sleek, modern design, elevated slightly, but not enough to survive anything more than a mild spring drizzle. Behind it, tents were set up for children's art workshops and nature clubs. The entire area was now being advertised as Camp Willow Bend, a summer program for kids ages 6 to 13. They'd even recruited volunteers to clear brush from the nearby hill slopes, which would have been fine if they hadn't uprooted the trees holding back the erosion line. Several of the stumps had been left open, creating pockets for runoff to gather. I made another note in my journal. Exposed root cavities, 37 feet from trail, 11 feet from storm trench, potential collapse zone. I sent one final email, short and firm, attaching every risk map I'd drafted in the past 90 days. It went not only to Karen and the HOA board, but also CC'd to the Woosh County Stormwater Management Office, and the local paper's environmental correspondent. No one replied. Instead, the next HOA newsletter included a curious paragraph. As always, we encourage residents to trust our board and vendors to make responsible decisions. Unqualified interference only confuses progress. Unqualified. That one word made me angrier than all the silence before it. I hadn't wanted control. I'd only wanted safety. But apparently, my license credentials and 4 decades of experience didn't qualify me to ask questions. The next day, my mailbox contained a letter from the HOA, fining me $75 for unauthorized distribution of materials after I'd left printed versions of my plans in the clubhouse lobby. They called it littering. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so typical. This wasn't about the trail anymore. It was about power, pride, reputation. They were protecting the image of unity and progress they'd worked so hard to manufacture. But beneath the mulch signage and summer brochures was a system of cracks, silent, invisible, and spreading. Then on the 3rd Tuesday of May, I opened my weather app and saw it a slow-moving atmospheric river forming in the Gulf, pulling moisture into the plains. A high-pressure front would hold it in place, keeping the storm parked over our region for possibly 2 days. The meteorologist called it historic. I called it inevitable. I closed my laptop, looked out toward the clouds forming low and thick over the horizon, and whispered to no one in particular, "It's coming." The morning after the Gulf system began its slow crawl inland, the air felt different. It carried a weight not just of humidity, but of inevitability. I stood at the edge of my back porch with a steaming mug in hand, watching the clouds spread like bruises across the sky. They didn't move fast. They hovered, swollen, dense, purposeful. It had been 3 days since I'd sent my final warnings. The county hadn't replied. The HOA certainly hadn't. And now what I had feared and modeled was materializing in the atmosphere above us. I dusted off my emergency maps and laid them across the dining table. Even though I'd committed every contour to memory, I still traced the old watershed paths with my finger. From the ridge above the trail, water would snake down through 2 ancient gullies, now both paved or filled, and collect at the trail's lowest point. Then it would push, search for relief, and when it couldn't find it, it would create its own. Water doesn't wait. I turned on the local news. They were already calling it a 100-year storm, quoting rainfall projections between 6 and 9 inches over the next 36 hours, with possible microbursts. Flash flood advisories were issued. The anchors smiled nervously between updates. No one was panicking yet. I wasn't nervous for myself. My house sat on elevated ground with a gravel-lined French drain I'd installed myself 2 years ago. But I couldn't stop thinking about the trail, about the kids' camp equipment they'd left down in the basin, about the restroom facility they'd built right over a known floodplain, and mostly about the people who would drive in from other towns to use the trail, not knowing what awaited when the clouds broke open. I sent one more email this time, with a blunt subject line. Emergency incoming rainfall will overwhelm trail infrastructure. Immediate closure recommended. I attached NOAA maps, rainfall models, and a revised impact assessment with time-stamped photos I'd taken of each hazard zone. I CC'd the Washoe County Environmental Response Unit, the HOA, and 3 local reporters. Then I sat back and waited. An hour later, I received the only direct response I'd get that day. It came from Karen Liddell. Mr. Halstead, we understand your concern. The trail has been evaluated by professionals and is in compliance with HOA standards. We advise against spreading fear or misinformation. The event planned for Saturday will proceed as scheduled, weather permitting. Regards, HOA Board. Weather permitting. I almost laughed. They still thought this was a question of scheduling, as if nature operated on a civic calendar. That afternoon, I made a decision I would document everything. I charged my camera batteries, labeled backup SD cards, and went for a final walk along the trail before the storm. The clouds were thick overhead, no rain yet, but the air crackled with electricity. I filmed the compromised sections of trail, the ones already eroded after mild spring showers. I filmed the clogged swale now overgrown with ivy, the improperly sloped parking pad, and the gathering pool behind the children's stage. At the base of the slope near the camp area, I stopped. The ground was wet, despite no rain yet. I crouched and pressed my hand into the earth. Water beaded at my fingertips. The soil was already saturated. The land was ready to release. The next morning, the first drops began around 4 a.m. I woke to the sound of them drumming lightly on my roof. By 6 a.m., they had evolved into a steady, unbroken curtain of rain pouring with intent. The forecast confirmed this wasn't passing. It was anchoring in place. By noon, the ditches on my street were full. The drains were beginning to gurgle. I drove to the trail entrance to check the parking area, purely as an observer. The HOA had placed cheerful camp in progress signs out front, and a few parents were unloading tents and sleeping bags under umbrellas despite the worsening downpour. I wanted to warn them, but I'd already been labeled the neighborhood doomsayer. Another warning from me might only backfire. Instead, I called the non-emergency county line. I calmly gave them my credentials, explained the situation, and asked on the record if any inspection team was being dispatched to HOA property for storm readiness. The dispatcher was polite vague, promised to pass the message along. By 3 p.m., the storm intensified. I watched from my office window as rain streamed in horizontal waves across my property. The runoff was flowing smoothly through my drainage system, but below me, where the trail wound along the base of the slope, I saw something far worse. A sudden gust peeled back the trees, and I caught a glimpse of whitewater churning fierce, cutting across the trail, where no stream had ever existed. The new camp stage was already tilting. A corner had buckled and collapsed. And still the rain came. By dusk, sirens began wailing. I heard the thundering crack of what could only have been the footbridge giving way. Moments later, an HOA staffer in a soaked green polo sprinted past my house, yelling into a walkie-talkie. "The trail's gone. The whole thing's gone." I grabbed my rain gear, my camera, and my badge from my days with the department, just in case someone questioned me at the scene. The time for warnings was over. It was time to witness. I reached the main path just as a fire truck blocked off the road leading to the trail. The parking lot was underwater. Cars floated, bumping against each other like forgotten toys. Parents were screaming, trying to reach children who'd been part of the day camp sessions. Emergency workers waded through waist-deep water, pulling kids out of tents now reduced to fabric flotsam. The stage was gone. The restrooms had collapsed inward. The eastern slope had cracked into a jagged trench. I had seen this kind of damage before, but never here, never so close to home. Karen stood frozen near the entrance, mascara streaked down her cheeks, her yellow raincoat plastered to her body. She clutched a clipboard like it could anchor her to reality. When she saw me, her mouth opened, but no words came. I didn't say anything. I simply raised my camera and pressed record, because this was no longer just a disaster. This was evidence. Rain has a sound when it's serious. Not the gentle hush of a spring shower, not even the drumming panic of a sudden downpour, but something deeper, heavier. It's the sound of weight bearing down on a world unprepared, the earth gasping under gallons it can't absorb fast enough. That night, the sound didn't stop. It didn't ease or drift. It pressed. I stood just beyond the fire truck barricade, watching the trail vanish under brown, seething water. The footbridge was entirely gone. The lights they'd installed along the trail floated like ghostly fireflies, flickering then blinking out as the battery banks shorted. The gravel path had ruptured in places, pieces of it swallowed by muddy channels carved with brutal, mindless precision. And everywhere, panic. Camp volunteers screamed orders no one followed. Children sobbed, clinging to soaked sleeping bags. A mother fell to her knees, frantically pulling a boy's arm out of a snagged tent corner. Every emergency worker was soaked to the bone, moving fast. But with that quiet edge of fear, professionals only show when the situation slips past protocol. I walked forward, ignoring the barricade, flashing the ID I kept from my emergency response days. It wasn't technically valid anymore, but few questioned a badge when chaos surrounded them. I slipped into the zone. An EMT called out, "Hey, are you with City Response?" Former stormwater engineer, I shouted over the rain. I wrote the buffer assessment for this region. He blinked at me, then pointed to the right. "We've got kids huddled in the tool shed northeast side of the campgrounds. Water's rising fast. They can't get out." I was already moving. My boots sank into mud. With each step, the suction slowing me down, dragging at my legs like regret. I reached the tool shed moments before the water did. A thin structure barely more than plywood and wishful thinking leaned sideways under the weight of wind and water. Inside, 4 children sat pressed against each other, shivering, their eyes huge. I took a step inside, kneeling. "Hey," I said gently. "We're getting you out. Stay close." The oldest, maybe 12, nodded, holding the smallest girl by the hand. I took off my jacket and wrapped it around her before lifting her into my arms. We sloshed out into the storm, wading against the growing torrent. I moved one kid at a time. Each trip back grew harder as the water rose past my thighs. By the time I brought the last child to safety, the tool shed had already broken from its moorings and listed sideways, the door ripped off and spinning downstream. Back at the staging area, Karen stood rooted like a statue, made of disbelief. Her mascara was gone, her mouth slack. I don't think she even noticed her clipboard had vanished. She said, barely audible. "You tried to warn us." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. She hadn't already heard nothing I hadn't already said. I turned away and helped guide the children into the warming tent the firefighters had erected. By midnight, the sky cracked open. It wasn't just rain anymore. It was sheets of water thrown sideways by wind that howled through the treetops and toppled what was left of the trail signs. The stream, normally a peaceful ribbon through the woods, had become a monster, angry, swollen, unstoppable. And every ounce of water it carried had no proper path to escape, because the HOA had blocked it, because they'd paved over its logic. The new restrooms crumbled from underneath as the soil was pulled out from their foundation. The concrete slabs broke apart like crackers soaked too long in soup. The stage, already gone hours before, had deposited splinters of itself across 3 properties downhill. One resident would later report finding a Camp Willowbend banner in her laundry room. At 2 a.m., the county finally issued a formal emergency declaration. Residents received phone alerts. Drones were deployed. The fire chief took command from the clubhouse, now converted into a response center. They asked me to assist with hydrology mapping on the spot. I did. I sketched out water flow paths, highlighted culverts in danger of clogging, advised on evacuating 4 homes along the lower east boundary. No one from the HOA questioned my involvement now. In fact, some avoided meeting my eyes entirely. Karen sat in a folding chair, blanket over her shoulders, staring at nothing. By dawn, the storm began to pull back. Not end, just ease its grip enough for the damage to become visible. The trail no longer existed. In its place, a gnarled scar of mud, splintered trees, and broken infrastructure. The slope near the parking lot had given way entirely, creating a 20-foot sinkhole where 6 cars had been parked. One was upside down, half submerged. A helicopter circled above. Local news. I gave a quick, measured interview. I didn't gloat. I didn't rant. I simply stated the facts. This trail was redesigned without adequate drainage consideration. Multiple warnings were submitted in writing. Had proper mitigation been followed, this outcome could have been significantly less severe. When they asked for my name, I gave it. John R. Halstead, retired engineer, resident. Then I turned and walked home. By noon, my inbox overflowed. One email stood out from the HOA County Inspector's Office. "Mr. Halstead, your documentation has been received and reviewed. We are opening an investigation into non-compliance and negligence related to the HOA-managed trail system. Additionally, we request your cooperation as a technical consultant during site assessment and reconstruction planning. Your expertise is not only welcome, it's necessary. Respectfully, Daniel Whitaker, Lead Inspector, Woke County Flood Control." I leaned back in my chair and exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. I hadn't wanted recognition. I hadn't needed vindication. But maybe now, just maybe, the land would be heard. When the rain stopped, the silence was heavier than the storm. It was a wet, gray hush. Not peaceful, but paralyzed. Water pooled across the streets and lawns like forgotten mirrors, reflecting sagging trees, collapsed signage, and the warped remains of what had once been prideful upgrades. The air smelled of wet soil, gasoline, and shredded mulch. The HOA's dream trail was gone, and with it the illusion of control they'd clung to so tightly. I returned to the site at sunrise, not because I had to, but because I needed to see it in full daylight. Damage looks different in the sun, clearer, harsher, more permanent. The footbridge had been ripped from its moorings and wedged sideways against the trunks of 2 trees 50 yards downstream. The gravel trail had been gouged into jagged trenches, some deep enough to swallow an adult to the waist. One of the solar lighting poles stuck out at an unnatural angle, its wiring spilling like veins from a broken limb. I wasn't the only one there. Residents trickled in slowly, murmuring among themselves, phones out documenting every collapsed bench and tilted kiosk. They looked stunned not just by the destruction, but by the realization that something they'd trusted, something managed by their own elected board, had utterly failed them. Lacey from the HOA events committee stood ankle-deep in mud, her clipboard gone, her sneakers ruined, whispering over and over. This was supposed to be the kickoff. This was supposed to be our big summer. A woman in a red jacket turned sharply toward her. You knew about the flood warnings, didn't you? You got the emails. You helped organize this whole mess. Lacey paled. I'm not the president. I just manage activities. Don't feed me that, the woman snapped. You all acted like you were above reproach. And now look at this. More people gathered, voices sharpened, fingers pointed. And then, almost as if on cue, someone pulled out a printed copy of one of my drainage reports, the same reports I'd handed out weeks ago. The HOA had ignored them, dismissed them as unqualified interference. But here they were again, no longer theories, just timestamps from a prophecy fulfilled. A man approached me quietly. Late 30s, hair matted with rain and sleep. You're the one who warned them, right? I nodded. My daughter was in that tent. You saved her. His voice cracked. Thank you. I didn't know what to say. I hadn't done anything heroic, just what needed to be done. But the emotion in his voice pierced something in me. The fatigue, the anger, the months of being ignored and laughed off it all sat differently now, heavier with stakes. By mid-morning, the HOA called an emergency meeting. Not in the clubhouse, it was still serving as a coordination center, but in the parking lot, now cleared of water, but strewn with debris. Karen arrived in silence, her hair frizzed, her suit damp at the hem. She didn't speak for several moments after stepping up onto a plastic milk crate. I know this is unprecedented. She began, her voice low and shaky. We never expected, because you ignored the warnings, someone shouted. Karen flinched. The engineer told you, yelled another voice. You fined him instead of listening. More voices piled on. The crowd pressed closer. Several people were waving their phones, screens lit up with emails. My emails. The ones that had gone unread, unopened, or worse, replied to with condescension. Karen tried again. We were acting on advice from vendors. You believed your image was more important than safety. It was the woman in red again. A man stepped forward. George Randall, a former fire chief who lived 2 streets over. This isn't just poor judgment, Karen. This is negligence. My grandson has a sprained wrist and water in his lungs because of your negligence. That word negligence landed like a thunderclap. Karen looked around, eyes darting, searching for backup. But none of her fellow board members spoke. Jim the treasurer had his arms crossed and his eyes down. Lacey was crying quietly behind a truck. The HOA stood alone, exposed without their walls of policy and procedure to shield them. Someone called out, we want to vote. Right now. Vote to suspend the board pending investigation. Another resident shouted, petitions already circulating. We'll get the signatures by tonight. Karen stepped off the crate without another word. She didn't run. She didn't argue. She just walked, head down, coat flapping behind her across the wreckage of the trail she'd once proudly dedicated with ribbon and smiles. Later that afternoon, I received a call from a man named Michael Graves. He was the lead claims investigator from the insurance group that handled the HOA's liability coverage. He wanted to meet in person. I agreed. When he arrived at my home, he brought with him a satchel full of printed documents, photographs, and disaster assessments. I've never seen a paper trail like yours, he said, sliding my drainage reports across my table. Every liability trigger we're tracking leads back to these early warnings. Then you know what happened wasn't an accident, I said. He nodded. That's why I'm here. Over the next hour, we reviewed photos of the site before and after the storm emails, with timestamps, invoices for construction work, and HOA newsletters that boasted about accelerated trail development with no mention of risk assessments. When we finished, Michael sighed. They may be looking at full liability. The insurance may not cover negligence this well documented, which means lawsuits, possibly personal. Good, I said flatly. People nearly died. He nodded again. We may need your testimony. You comfortable with that? I've been ready for months. That night, the HOA website went down. Residents posted screenshots showing that several pages, including the ones listing board members and project vendors, had been scrubbed or redirected. But it was too late. The damage was done, both to the land and to the trust people had placed in those who claimed to lead them. I watched the sky from my porch as night fell. No stars, just a blanket of haze, and moisture still lingering like a bruise on the atmosphere. I thought of the trees that had been cut to make way for signs, of the children whose summer would now be remembered not for campfires and crafts, but for the sound of tents ripping in the wind. And I thought of water, relentless, logical, unapologetic. It had done what it always does. It had followed the path of least resistance, and this time that path had led straight through a lie. I had kept everything. That's the thing about being ignored for long enough, you learn to document. Every email, every photo, every offhand comment muttered at a board meeting or scribbled on a community bulletin became part of what I now referred to privately as the archive. It had started as a folder on my desktop, labeled simply drainage. But over the course of 3 months, it had blossomed into 5 folders, 89 files, and a color-coded binder organized by date, subject, and consequence. When Michael Graves, the insurance investigator, left my house that evening, he had copies of every critical file. He'd asked for them once I gave him everything twice, one printed, one digital. Because I wasn't just preparing to testify, I was preparing to end this completely. The morning after, I received an unexpected knock at my door. John Halstead. I opened the door to a short woman in a county jacket, boots, still caked in dried mud. Her name tag read, M. Callahan, Office of Environmental Oversight. I've been assigned to lead the formal investigation into the Willow Bend HOA, storm damage, and potential code violations, she said. Your name came up more than once. I invited her in. We sat for nearly 2 hours. She asked precise, measured questions, not just about the storm, but about the lead-up. The tone of the HOA, their response or lack thereof, the timing of construction, the changes to runoff lines, the failure to submit updated plans to the city. When I showed her my binder, she smiled for the first time. You catalog this like a court exhibit. Experience teaches you, I said, that being right doesn't mean anything unless it's provable. She nodded slowly. You'd be surprised how few people think to do that. Or maybe not. Before she left, she handed me a card. You'll likely be contacted by the county attorney's office. What you've compiled, it's more than evidence. It's precedent. She paused. By the way, the vendor the HOA contracted for their original trail upgrades, they were operating under an expired certification. Of course they were. That evening, I walked the edge of the trail again, or what was left of it. The cleanup crews had begun their assessments, marking broken areas with neon flags and hazard tape. The air still smelled sour from the mix of uprooted roots and soaked asphalt. But the real stench wasn't physical. It was reputational. The HOA had built their authority like it was granite. The storm revealed it for what it truly was, particle board and hubris. Residents no longer averted their eyes when they saw me. In fact, they often approached with questions, with apologies, or simply with a quiet thank you. An elderly couple I barely knew handed me a gift basket with baked goods. A teenager asked if he could shadow me for a school project on infrastructure failure. One woman with tears in her eyes said, if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't said something, and still part of me couldn't shake the hollow in my chest, because saying something hadn't been enough. Not in time. That night, I reread my earliest email, the very first warning I had sent Karen and the HOA board. The tone was calm, measured, almost gentle. I had still believed in diplomacy then. I printed that email and added it to the front of the binder. The next week brought more letters. A subpoena from the county attorney's office requesting my testimony for the public hearing. A formal apology letter from 2 HOA board members who had resigned, not Karen, of course. And a certified letter from the HOA's legal counsel requesting a meeting. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I attended the next emergency HOA meeting, held in a temporary space at the firehouse. A folding table served as the board's dais. The room was packed not with cupcakes and community chatter, but with quiet fury and crossed arms. People had come not for updates, but for accountability. Karen looked like she hadn't slept in days. She took the microphone and tried to begin. We want to assure you, someone in the front stood and raised a copy of my drainage report. No, he said firmly. You don't get to assure anyone. He warned you. You punished him. And now our homes, our kids, our trust all drowned under your negligence. The room erupted at applause, not joy vindication. Karen tried again, but she was drowned out. Someone else shouted, "Let John speak." Voices echoed, "Let him speak." I didn't want to. I truly didn't. But I stood anyway. I stepped to the front, took the mic, and looked at the rows of neighbors, people I'd shared fences with, waved at from porches, nodded to at mailbox clusters. I'm not here to say I told you so, I began, though I could. A dry laugh moved through the room. I'm here because this community is still standing. Barely, but standing. That wasn't luck, that was warning. That was the outcome of 1,000 small choices, most of them bad, by people who didn't think consequences would ever find them. I let the silence hang. I offered my help for free. I tried to serve. I was told I was overreacting, that I was unqualified. I was fined. Several heads turned toward Karen. I don't want revenge, I said. I want responsibility. And I want to guarantee that this board will never again treat expertise like a threat. I stepped down. The room was silent for a moment. Then someone stood and began to clap. Then another. Soon the entire hall was on its feet. Karen left through a side door and didn't return. The next day, the county attorney's office sent me a formal thank you. The HOA's insurer announced they would not cover the damages due to proven negligence, and the city placed the HOA under temporary administrative supervision pending re-election of the board. The trail as it had been would never be rebuilt. But something better might rise from the mud. The official investigation began on a Monday, just as the last of the broken signage was being carted off in the back of a dump truck. The county had already done its part, flagged the worst of the safety hazards, issued notices of code violations, and frozen the HOA's discretionary spending until further notice. But when the State Environmental Review Board showed up with clipboards, drones, and a full inspection team in tow, I knew this wasn't just cleanup anymore. It was reckoning. I met them at the edge of the trail, what remained of it. 3 state engineers, a hydrologist, and one very sharp woman from legal named Alexis Brenner. She looked around slowly, lips pressed tight as her boots sank into the silt-laden mud. "Your Halstead?" she asked, not with doubt but with curiosity. "Yes. We've read your assessments, all of them." She didn't say impressive. She didn't have to. Her tone was clear. What I had provided them wasn't just useful, it was damning. We'll be documenting everything. The trail, the structures, the rerouted runoffs, the non-compliant grading, the construction without permits. She pointed toward a downed lighting pole where a shallow trench had become a stagnant brown pool. "That right there, that's going in the report. It's a breeding pit." She turned back to me. "Would you be willing to walk us through it? Help us understand the sequence of failure." I nodded, already pulling out my notepad and waterproof maps. For the next 4 hours, I guided them through the disaster section by section, drain by failed drain. I showed them where the runoff had overtopped the trail, where the improperly laid gravel had created slide zones, where the culverts had collapsed under pressure because their mouths had never been cleared. The worst part wasn't the damage. It was how avoidable it all had been. Alexis took notes, but mostly she just listened. When I pulled out my phone and showed her the email from 3 months prior, the one where I'd warned of an overflow zone right behind the restroom facility, she shook her head. "And they called this fear-mongering." "They did more than that," I said. "They fined me $75 for posting a copy of that warning in the clubhouse." That made her pause. "Do you still have the letter?" "Framed it," I said deadpan, "right above my utility sink." She smiled, just slightly. By the end of the day, the state team had filled a full report binder. Before they left, Alexis turned to me. "This is going to become a case study," she said. "Not just for mismanagement, but for community safety. You understand the significance of what you did here." "I didn't do it for significance," I replied. "I just didn't want anyone to get hurt." Well, she said, stepping into her vehicle, "Your HOA's about to learn that ignoring expertise carries a cost." The fallout came in waves. First, the State Board of Infrastructure Compliance issued a cease and desist on all future construction within HOA jurisdiction pending oversight. That meant no trail repairs, no summer camp facilities, not even new benches, until a complete engineering review was completed and approved. Then came the public report, published in a digital PDF that spread across the county's social networks like wildfire. It was titled, A failure by design. The Willow Bend Trail collapse and the cost of ignored warnings. My name was in it, along with scans of my drainage plans, photographic evidence of the ignored runoff zones, and timelines showing how long the HOA had before the storm hit and how little they did. Several local newspapers picked it up. The county mayor tweeted about it, thanking concerned citizens who refused to be silenced. The story made the evening news. I watched the segment from my living room, a bowl of cold chili forgotten in my lap. The drone footage was hard to look at: twisted metal, buckled pavement, flooded picnic zones. Then came the interviews. One by one, residents spoke to the camera. He warned them. They didn't listen. My nephew was almost swept away in that flood. We're lucky more kids weren't hurt. The board cared more about how it looked than if it worked. And finally, Karen appeared on screen just for a moment. Her voice trembled as she admitted, "We believed we were following the best available advice." But the footage that followed was even more damning. The vendor they had used for consultation had a revoked license and 2 lawsuits pending for previous failures. It was a paper-thin excuse. The HOA's liability insurer formally withdrew coverage. Without protection, the board members were personally responsible for legal claims. And those came fast. I wasn't the one suing. I had no interest in money or revenge. But several families, especially those with children who'd been endangered, filed claims. One resident lost their basement to mudslides because of diverted runoff. Another had a vehicle destroyed in the sinkhole. The HOA's legal fund drained quickly. The board began resigning one by one. By the second week of June, the HOA had no functioning leadership. That's when the city stepped in and offered a proposal to form a temporary resident reconstruction committee to help rebuild both the trail and the governance structure. It wouldn't be run by outsiders. It would be neighbors with expertise who actually listened. Someone nominated me for the committee. At first, I said no. I didn't want the meetings, the politics, the snide looks from those who still resented being wrong. But then a woman I barely knew knocked on my door with a petition. "We need someone who knows how things work," she said. "Not just pipes and drainage, but consequences." So I accepted. At our first meeting, we sat in the library's back room, folding chairs arranged in a circle, blueprints spread across 2 tables. It felt different than the HOA meetings, less posturing, more listening. "I don't want this to be about blame," I said, "but we're going to do this right. That means respecting the land, not conquering it." They agreed. We brought in certified engineers. We walked the trail as a group. We listened to input from every resident who showed up. No decision was made in secret. Every design included redundancies, emergency overflow basins, and proper materials. The trail wouldn't just be rebuilt, it would be reborn. Not a vanity project, a lifeline. One afternoon, weeks later, I passed by Karen. She was walking her dog, alone, no clipboard, no power aura. She saw me and hesitated. I gave a nod, a civil one. To my surprise, she walked over. "I read the report," she said. I waited. "I was wrong," she added. "About you?" "About all of it." I said nothing. Let it hang. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, "but I do regret." That word regret felt real. It didn't fix anything, but it mattered. "Don't say it to me," I said finally. "Say it to the people who lost more than pride." She nodded and walked on. And for the first time since the rain came, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, not vindication. Something quieter, closer to peace. The change didn't happen all at once. It never does. Communities like rivers don't flood in an instant. They rise slowly, pressure building in quiet places until the levee finally breaks. In the weeks following the state investigation and the resignation of the HOA board, I started noticing things, subtle things. Lawn signs with the phrase, "Listen to experts," appeared in front yards. People who used to cross the street to avoid me now waved from their porches. The mother whose son I'd carried from the tool shed during the flood sent me a handwritten letter. Not long, not poetic, just real. "I used to think you were the problem. I was wrong. You saved my boy. Thank you." There were more apologies, quiet ones. A nod at the post office, a pie left on my porch, a folded note slipped under my front door. You didn't yell. You didn't gloat. That's strength. But it wasn't about me. The community itself was changing. The old blind trust in the HOA, once so absolute it bordered on cultish, was gone. Residents started asking questions. Not whispered questions, but loud ones. Who signed off on the lighting system? Why didn't they hold public hearings? What happened to the budget for the runoff project they promised last year? And the answers when they came weren't pretty. A small group of residents, led by George Randall, the retired fire chief, and a woman named Maria Sanchez, whose backyard had been partially flooded, formed a watchdog group. They called themselves Willow Bend Forward, and their first act was to publish a complete audit of the last 5 years of HOA spending. They got it through public records requests now that the board had no legal shield left. What they found made people furious. Over $40,000 spent on decorative signage for the trail. Nearly $18,000 on community branding consultants. And perhaps most infuriating, an invoice for $12,000, labeled Emergency Soil Assessment, paid to a landscaping company with no civil engineering credentials. The same company that had improperly laid gravel over the runoff lines. Town halls were packed. Residents who'd never attended a single HOA meeting now came early, holding printouts highlighting inconsistencies. They wanted names. They wanted resignations. They wanted accountability. And for the first time, they got it. Karen Ha. System Karen, now fully out of power but still living in the neighborhood, issued a public statement through a local blog. She admitted to errors in judgment and placing aesthetic over function. She stopped short of naming names, but the damage was done. Her name had become synonymous with the collapse. The trail remained closed, still marked with yellow tape and under redesigned signage. But even in that disrepair, it had become a symbol not of failure, but of warning. And for the children, it had become a story. One afternoon, while helping the reconstruction committee set up a listening booth outside the local farmer's market, a girl no older than 10 pointed at me and whispered to her mother, "That's him, the man who saved the trail." I smiled. It wasn't true, not exactly. I didn't save the trail. I tried to save the people who used it. The trail, well, it sacrificed itself to prove a point. As the new committee took root, real progress began. We drafted bylaws that required third-party engineering reviews for any project impacting public safety. We created a mandatory 30-day public comment period for all major HOA decisions, and we ensured that every trail or park improvement had to include an environmental impact statement. At first, the proposals faced resistance. Old guard members still grumbled about bureaucracy, but public support overpowered them. People wanted transparency, not platitudes. I was invited to chair the subcommittee for stormwater mitigation. It wasn't a title I wanted, but it was a job that mattered. Our first major vote was to allocate funds to rebuild the trail using bioengineering principles. Natural contours, rain gardens, living barriers of native plants that slowed water instead of resisting it. No more gravel sheets, pretending to be infrastructure. And we named the new design model after the event that made it possible, Halstead Protocols. I didn't want the name. I protested. But Maria put her hand on my shoulder and said, "You spent months being ignored. Let this stand so no one forgets why we needed change in the first place." Later that summer, the reconstruction began, not with backhoes and cement trucks, but with residents. Hands in dirt. Volunteers planting native sedge along the embankments. Teenagers placing permeable pavers. Children painting trail signs with slogans like "Slow the Flow" and "Respect the Earth." I stood beside George Randall as we watched the first section reopen, about a quarter-mile stretch lined with dogwood and switchgrass. "It's not just a trail anymore," he said. "It's a memory." A pause, then quieter, and a warning. We both nodded. That same week, a journalist from the state's largest newspaper contacted me. She wanted to do a feature, "The Engineer Who Fought the Flood." I declined the spotlight but agreed to an interview about policy reform. When the article came out, the headline surprised me. A man with a map and a warning, how one neighbor helped a community listen again. I clipped it and pinned it to my garage wall next to my license, my first drainage schematic, and a photograph of the trail taken from above. In it, the trail wound through green and gold like a ribbon, scarred, yes, but healing. And then came the day I didn't expect. At a community potluck, hosted by Willow Bend Forward, Karen approached me again. She looked different. Smaller, maybe? Or just quieter. "I know I failed," she said simply. "I don't expect you to forget." "I haven't," I said. "But I don't hold it the way I used to." She offered a hesitant smile. "I'd like to help. Somewhere. Anywhere." I pointed to a folding table where kids were painting wooden trail markers. Start there. They're better listeners than most adults I've met. She nodded and walked that way. And for the first time, I felt the ground beneath me shift, not under threat, not from pressure, but something lighter. Something like trust beginning again. The water had come. It had swallowed ruin torn down. But now in its wake, something better was growing. The first time I walked the rebuilt portion of the trail, I carried nothing but a notepad and a weather app open on my phone. Old habits. It had rained that morning. Not heavy, not dangerous, just enough to test the land. I followed the curve of the new path, boots crunching softly against stabilized gravel stitched with binding agents and lined with low living berms of tall grass. Not a single puddle stood where they shouldn't. It worked. Every design, every slope adjustment, every choice we fought for, it all worked. 2 rain gardens filtered runoff just past the turn near the old camp area. They overflowed into a wide swale we'd reshaped to match the natural terrain. Children had planted wildflowers along the banks. Someone had painted a wooden sign that said, "Where the water learns to breathe." I'd seen a lot of trails in my life. Urban ones, mountain passes, city parks engineered into plastic perfection. But this trail, it was alive. It understood its own ecosystem now. And it was because the community finally chose to listen to the land and to each other. The rebuilding process hadn't been easy. Budget fights, supply delays, volunteers showing up late, and occasionally the old whisper of HOA-style power games trying to sneak back in. But something had changed in people. Once they saw the damage that silence and ego could cause, they refused to go back. George Randall, now semi-retired from even his firehouse volunteer work, stood beside me on the day we reopened the final stretch. He leaned on his cane, surveying the green slope below where the old stage had once been. "You remember the first time we stood here?" he asked. "I do. Rain up to our shins. Tents floating." He gave a dry laugh. "We've earned this view." The trail ribbon was cut by a 4th-grade girl named Elise, whose tent had nearly been swept away during the flood. Her father stood just behind her, a quiet smile on his face. I watched as Elise tugged the scissors with both hands, the crowd applauding when the ribbon fluttered to the ground like a blue river. A new beginning. Soon after, the President Reconstruction Committee evolved into something more permanent. The city offered support to formalize it as a standing neighborhood advisory council, not a replacement HOA, but a parallel structure, one that advised, questioned, challenged. I didn't want to lead it, but I offered to train whoever would. Maria Sanchez volunteered. She'd been fierce throughout the entire process, sharp-eyed, clear-voiced, and unwilling to let the past slip into shadow. I met with her weekly, handed her all my old notes, taught her how to read grading plans and interpret hydrology models. She learned fast. I also returned to teaching, not in a formal way, no chalkboards or lecture halls. But people from other neighborhoods started calling. Small communities, rural subdivisions, even a lakefront HOA from 2 counties over. They asked the same things. How do we know if our systems are safe? How do we question the board without getting fined? What if they just ignore us? So I created a free online workshop. Water Knows the Truth, a simple name. An unpolished site, just videos and documents. But it spread. I'd get emails from across the state, sometimes across the country. Engineers, activists, grandmothers who didn't understand zoning laws, but knew when something felt wrong. I responded to every single one. One foggy morning, months later, I walked the trail alone. The leaves had begun to fall, gathering in quiet orange pools along the edges. I paused at the highest bend, the spot that had once held a picnic bench that was swept away, then replaced by a circle of boulders and native sedge. A new plaque sat atop a wooden post, in memory of what almost was and in gratitude for those who spoke before the flood. I hadn't written it. I didn't know who did. But I stood before it a long while. Behind me, I heard a voice. "You coming to the town meeting tonight?" It was Maria, hiking, boots muddy and hair in a ponytail. I turned, smiling. Wouldn't miss it. "They're voting on the new transparency charter." "About time," I said. "Think it'll pass." "With what we've built," she said, "they'd need a bigger flood to stop it." We both laughed. Not because it was funny, but because we knew how true it was. The meeting was held at the community center, newly renovated using grant funds, earned through the Resilient Design Award we'd won from the state. The room buzzed with conversation. Children played quietly in the corner while adults flipped through packets printed on recycled paper. The charter passed unanimously. No more secret board decisions. No more contracts without peer review. A 45-day review window for any public works. Mandatory third-party inspection for structural changes. Whistleblower protection for residents. It wasn't just progress, it was transformation. And yet not once did anyone speak of vengeance. Not once did anyone mention Karen by name. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about the space between one warning and the next. It was about what filled that silence. That night, I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, and watched a line of clouds drift lazily across the stars. Not a storm, just the sky stretching, breathing. The air smelled like fresh pine and damp earth, and quiet hope. I thought about the boy whose hand I'd held during the flood. The girl who'd cut the ribbon. The man who'd called me a meddler and later sent me homemade jam with a note that read, "Turns out some warnings are blessings." And I thought about what we leave behind when we're finally heard. Not headlines, not plaques, but trails. Winding through memory, through consequence, through healing. And if we're lucky, through home. The next time I saw Karen Liddell, it was almost a year to the day since the storm. The air had turned cool again, that brief sliver of autumn, when the mornings smell like burnt leaves, and the wind doesn't just blow it. Whispers. I was walking the trail alone, running my fingers along the cedar railing we'd installed on the eastern overlook. And there she was, sitting on the new bench by the rain garden alone, hands folded over a notebook. I hadn't seen her much since she resigned. She kept to herself mostly. She no longer held the clipboard, no longer hosted HOA cocktail hours, or walked with the familiar authority that once seemed inseparable from her name. She looked normal, human. She saw me, and before I could say a word, she stood. "John," she said softly, "do you mind if I walk with you?" I hesitated just for a beat, then I nodded. We walked in silence for a while. Birds rustled through the grass. The gravel crunched beneath our feet. Water moved through the swales in gentle arcs, a language only the land remembered. "I don't think I ever really apologized," she finally said. I kept walking, saying nothing. "I didn't just ignore you," she continued. "I dismissed you. I told people you were exaggerating, that you were too obsessed with technicalities, that you were difficult. You weren't wrong about that last one," I said. She smiled genuinely for once. "Maybe. But you were trying to help. I just didn't want to be told I was wrong. Not by someone who wasn't part of the board. I thought leadership meant knowing better than everyone else." "Leadership means listening," I said. "Even when it's uncomfortable. Especially then." She nodded slowly. "I see that now." We stopped at the clearing where the stage used to be. Now it was just open earth, framed by native shrubs and stone. A few kids had stacked river rocks into tiny towers along the path's edge. I noticed Karen watching them. "I don't expect to be forgiven," she said. "Not really, but I needed to say it to you, out loud." I thought about that for a while. Then I looked at her. "I don't need an apology," I said. "I needed this trail to stop being a liability. I needed kids to be safe. I needed anyone to listen when I said the ground was screaming. You didn't. But now, you are." She wiped a tear that surprised even her. "Thank you." I let that settle between us. She started volunteering not long after that, quietly. No titles, no agenda. She helped stain the new benches. She helped collect trash after community events. And once I saw her teaching a group of kids how to plant sedge along the banks of the runoff basin. It didn't erase the past, but it changed her presence in the present. Forgiveness, I'd learned, wasn't a transaction. It wasn't earned with apologies or gestures. It was grown like anything else, nurtured in the soil of recognition, accountability, and a willingness to change. The trail was fully reopened that November. No ribbon this time. No brass bands. Just people. Walking. Laughing. Breathing. I sat on one of the benches with Maria and George, both sipping coffee and watching the sun come up through the golden trees. The path shimmered slightly with dew, and the creek, once wild with fury, hummed a calm rhythm as it flowed between its now secure banks. "You ever think you'd live to see it like this?" George asked. "I dreamed of it," I said. "But no, I didn't think we'd ever get it this right." Maria looked over. "You realize what you started, don't you?" I shook my head. "I didn't start anything. The flood did." "No," she said. "The flood broke things. You were the one who didn't let us ignore the cracks." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. That Christmas, the city issued a formal proclamation naming the trail a model for resilient urban design. They called it the Halstead Model, much to my discomfort. A city councilwoman even suggested naming the entire trail after me. I declined. I told them to name it after the creek, Cotton Bend. Its original name from a century ago, back when people still looked at maps drawn by hand and trusted what the rivers were trying to say. They agreed. On the last page of the trail's new guide map, there's a quote, not from me, from a local poet whose daughter had nearly drowned during the flood. Some lessons arrive like rain loud uninvited and washing away what was never meant to last. But if you're willing to plant again, even that storm can become part of the root. In the spring, I received a letter from a town I'd never heard of. Dear Mr. Halstead, we heard about what happened in Willow Bend. Our HOA is reviewing some of our own trail systems, and we were wondering if you might be willing to look over a few things. And so it began again. Not with a warning, but with an invitation. I still walk the trail almost every morning. Not to check on it. Not anymore. But because it reminds me what happens when good people stop being silent. When fear of being difficult is replaced by the courage to be honest. When the water speaks and finally someone listens. I walk it for the kids whose laughter returned. For the families who now see this place as a home again, not a risk. And maybe a little I walk it for myself. Because long before the rain came, something had already been broken. Not the trail, but our trust in each other. And now plank by plank, root by root, we had rebuilt it. Not perfectly, but stronger. And this time, when the skies darken again, and they will be ready. Because we remembered, because we cared, because we finally chose to listen.